Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al-Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to On the Middle East, Al-Monitor's flagship podcast on the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Amran Zaman, and today I'll be talking about what Western governments should be doing in Syria, where an al-Qaeda offshoot, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, seized power last month after overthrowing the regime of Bashar al-Assad. My guest is Nikolaos van Dam, a renowned Arabist who served as the ambassador of the Netherlands to numerous Arab countries and more recently as the country's Syria envoy. Nikolaos is the author of several well-received books on contemporary Syria, including The Struggle for Power in Syria. Welcome to our program, Ambassador. Great to have you with us here.
Thank you very much.
So in a recent article for Al-Majalla, you described at some length how the West in particular, by projecting their own Western civilizational discourse on Syria, were actually doing more harm than good, placing very sort of unrealistic expectations on the Assad regime at a time when there was talk of sort of reconciling the regime with the opposition. Looking at what the West is doing today, the Europeans, the Americans, would you say that they're again repeating the same mistakes, or are they handling this new situation in Syria with more pragmatism?
Well, let me first say I hope so. One of the things is, for instance, the sanctions. I think to give the new regime, the new Syria, when you call it the new Syria, a chance, then you should lift the sanctions. But if you wait, you make it more difficult for the new rulers to get things in order. So there are various countries which have visited Syria. I mean, various ministers of Germany, of France, and missions of these missionaries of these countries, but they're still hesitating whether or not to lift the sanctions. So this is one thing. If they want to do things well, then they should lift the sanctions immediately. And of course, when you want to be pragmatic, if things go very wrongly in their perspectives, they could always impose sanctions again. By the way, I don't think in general sanctions help, because sanctions are meant to impose on the other party something with the intention of changing their behavior, what it has hardly ever happened. So it's a hope. And then, of course, also the new regime, I still call it a regime because, well, they don't have a government. They have a government, but temporarily a transitional government. But it is also still waiting what is going to happen, how it will turn out, whether this new regime of Ahmed al-Sharaa, whether they can do what they promise or what they intend, or what the portrait, what Ahmed al-Sharaa has done. He has completely changed from, let's say, a jihadist, al-Qaeda, from an extremist to a personality, at least certainly from the outside, who is moderate and pragmatic. And so if we are to believe him, I am personally inclined to believe him. You can say it is wishful thinking, but what else can you do in the present situation? You must give it a chance. So he portrays himself as being moderate in general, moderate towards other religious groups, and so on. So, and also you must give people a chance to change. I mean, to change what I call for the better. But he must also have his followers to do what he wants them to do, and that is not a simple thing. It doesn't mean that if the leader says you must do so and so, that his followers will automatically do so as well, because they're in general very different. They have grown up in a situation of conflict, of repression. And now, for instance, you have at present, I had expected that there would be a lot of revenge against the rulers, but we're still in a very primary stage. Sorry. So there already have been some revenge actions, but not on a very big scale. I had expected it to be on a much bigger scale. It may still happen because Syria is in a situation, it's in a very bad situation. It is economically almost bankrupt. The people are very poor. They don't have much to eat. So you have priorities in life. So if you have nothing to eat, you want to eat. If you don't have money at all, you don't want to have money. How can you generate all these things in a short time? Which means that now there is a kind of euphoria. They are very glad that the regime is gone, and you see all kinds of Syrians going gladly returning to their homes, expecting they exist, but they don't exist in many cases. They're rubble. But what about 1 month? What about 2 months? What about a year? Because the new rulers, they have suggested that there will be elections after 4 years, and the constitution will take 3 years, which means that between now and 4 years, if that is going to happen, there can be a lot of conflict. So in that sense, the countries which can help Syria, they should help Syria, and they should be forthcoming.
Well, of course, the fear, I imagine, the concern with these countries is, well, the more they help, the more this current government can consolidate its hold, and the less influence they can therefore have on its behavior. It's a classic sort of, conundrum. So bearing that in mind, and judging by what you said we have to give this guy a chance. But again, we're projecting our own values on this country. And you know Syria very well. And the fact that it's a Sunni majority country, and this guy is a Sunni and an Islamist, can we assume that the majority of Sunnis in Syria kind of support his worldview, but I mean, a more moderate version of that? Are they comfortable with the idea of an Islamist running the country?
I think for the time being, there is no alternative. If the things would go as normal, between quotation marks, then one authoritarian regime would be replaced by another authoritarian regime, if not dictatorial regime. And in that, indeed, this is very true. In 4 years, he can completely consolidate his position. He wants to disarm all other groups. So let's say that he says the government should have all arms, which is very correct. But then if he has all arms, then he has the monopoly of power, which means then he can do everything he wants, with the danger, of course, that there will be a new civil war. And this should, of course, be prevented at all costs. But I think in general, many Sunni people, the majority of the Syrian population, they could well live, I think, with a moderate Islamic government. I mean, they are traditional, but it's different from an Islamist government. I mean, they have their customs, their traditions, so they will be more traditional. That would be no problem. But if he wants to impose all kinds of religious things, and we have already seen some first signs, then, but these are also to a certain extent outward things, like women have to be a little bit different. But like, for instance, the Western media made a big point that he didn't shake hands with the German foreign minister, and this German foreign minister was, in my view, very inappropriately dressed.
She was tight-fitting jeans, yes.
She would never appear in such clothes in the Bundestag, in the German parliament.
True.
If you see how in Western media, to put it a little bit extremely, if a man gives a woman a small, what do you call it, chat on the shoulder, then it can already be explained as sexual intimidation. So in general, I think that most people could well live with a traditional government, but not when it is imposing things. So, for instance, the people in general, let's say the women of Alawites, they're more liberal. And so they will have difficulty if they would have to wear veil. If you will walk around in Damascus in the previous, you would see women who would dress very conservatively, and others not. So as long as they leave people do as they like moderately, it's no point. But if they want to impose, then it will be different. And this trend can...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ambassador, but I mean, it's still very early days, hence the potential exists for some accommodations. And again, my question to you, there are elites, I mean, that are still, in Damascus who made their fortunes with the old Assad regime. Do you think that they need to be co-opted in some way to strike this kind of balance that you're talking about? Including Alawites and Christians and others.
I'm sure they must accommodate them because I think this was always the so-called ideal picture of Syria as a mosaic of various different groups, religious, ethnic groups, and by the way, this so-called mosaic was the stones of the mosaic were held together usually by the authoritarian regime. So if the regime changes, then the stones of the mosaic can be shifted completely. But I think it's essential for a new Syria to be a moderate Syria to respect all groups, and I mean not tolerate the groups, because toleration means from someone from above tolerates others, but respecting others is a different thing. So this is something which also needs some, I would say, education, that people learn to respect one another, not just to tolerate one another. And this is, I think, the previous regime, they didn't really tolerate the conservative people, let alone the Islamist people, not only because they were secularists, but also because they saw them as a threat to their regime. I think this is a point. But I think the elites must be accommodated, but then, of course, at the same time, the corruption must be banned, which is something extremely difficult, not only for in a situation with most people are extremely poor, people military at roadblocks, they want some money and so on. This will be difficult to conquer, and it will be difficult under any regime to combat corruption. But this is also one of the elements which the new regime has to bring about. So there is a danger that they become an Islamist regime. But if they have learned something from the past, and I think people like Ahmed al-Sharaa, they have, of course, for many years able to observe what it means to have war, to have conflict, to have violence. So I think this is also one of the reasons, I'm perhaps very optimistic for him to have these moderate statements. So indeed.
Sorry again, I interrupted, but we're looking at Egypt, for example. That, I guess, offers a lesson to Ahmed al-Sharaa about the risks posed by any extreme, if you will, behavior, right? But the difference, of course, in Syria is that the army is nothing. There's nothing. What would be the countervailing force, the sort of moderating, if you will, even force that would check any instincts of the kind you described? Could it possibly be even the Kurds, who have this very different model of governance in the north?
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
Well, first going into the Kurds. The Kurds, I say the Kurds, but I should express myself more precisely. The Kurds which are dominated by the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the PYD. They are, I think the PYD, SDF, is a authoritarian force. And why do I say this? Because most other Kurdish parties in Syria, about 15 or even more, they're against this SDF. So the SDF wants to have self-determination, self-determination, self-rule in the areas which they dominate. But if you want to be democratic at the same time in the whole of Syria, and then in that part it's only ruled by one Kurdish party, which is being against most other Kurdish parties, you have then as a self-rule which is authoritarian rule. And then moreover, these Kurdish areas, or let's say the areas which are dominated by the Syrian Democratic Forces, are not all Kurdish areas, because in Syria you have only 3 enclaves where there is a Kurdish majority, which is Hasaka and Kobani and another one. So they want to link, they have linked all these areas, but they're not all Kurdish areas. So you have let's say a stage where the Kurds want to have self-rule in an area which is not all Kurdish. So this is a complication. It's still a huge potential for conflict, because at the one time they don't want to just give in their arms, because then they're without any power. And on the other hand, Turkey wants to eliminate these organizations. Checks and balances, this is very difficult. If you say the army is nothing, but it is nothing in the sense internationally, because Israel has destroyed most potent arms and so on. But still, they have the army, let's say the new army, it has traditional weapons. I mean, they don't have sophisticated weapons, but with traditional arms, you can also suppress people very easily. So this is huge. Let's say there are no checks and balances, because if the new regime has all arms, they are delivered to the new regime. They cannot do anything if the regime is not of good faith to establish a new democratic regime. So, for instance, if you have 4 years for elections, in the meantime, it's a very long time. It's not a very long time in a country which is already democratic. Well, but it's a very long time in a country which is undemocratic, which is in such a bad shape. So therefore, I think I repeat it, but therefore it's so important just to give them in good faith, because if you want to impose on the regime all kinds of things from abroad, then things may go very wrong. And as happened in the past, that many countries supported different groups, different armed groups. Like, let's say, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they supported different groups, and these different groups, they fought one another inside Syria. So all this was, I think, one of the, let's say, the curses of this civil war, that all countries tried to intervene, but in their own interest. In a way, it's like Western countries. They want democracies everywhere else, except if those countries turn out to choose people whom they don't want. Yeah, you have seen that in Algeria, for instance, with the Front Islamique, I think FNS, Front National Islamique. And the same in Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement in Gaza. When they won, well, they don't want it. So this is something they want to people in other countries in power who are their allies. That's it. Nope, not. And as long as they democratically elect their friends, it's okay. But if they elect their non-friends or even enemies, then preferably not.
So if we zoom out a bit now and talk about these foreign countries, first of all, would you agree with the assessment that Turkey has emerged as the most influential actor in Syria today?
I think so, except that still countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, let's say the very rich countries, they can financially support Syria recovering. And in that respect, they are more important than Turkey. But Turkey has, of course, a military strategic important position. And I think Hayat Tahrir al-Sham of al-Sharaa, they are on good terms with Turkey because perhaps they were not friends, but Turkey had to cooperate in a way with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because if Turkey would have wanted HTS to be removed, it would mean war and it would mean more refugees to Turkey. Strategically, I think Turkey is the most important influencer, military, and also with this conflict with the Kurds in Syria, and then of course with reflection in Turkey.
But we also have Israel in Syria, and they have taken advantage of that situation to address their own security concerns by, as you said, taking out a lot of the Syrian military's more, lethal, shall we say, equipment, and by occupying the buffer zone. Going forward, do you think that Israel will also have the potential to shape politics at some level inside Syria?
Well, only in a negative sense. Israel wants so-called peace, but it can never achieve peace with this policy, with this behavior. It will create more and more enemies. Well, of course, from the practical point of view, the Syrian Assad regime, there has hardly ever been shot any bullet from the government in the direction of Israel. So they were not threatened at all. They were, in a way, they could say they were comfortable with the Syrian regime because it had no potential to do anything to them. As I interpret the new regime in Syria, they are pragmatic, like Assad, that what is the use of attacking Israel if it will only be destroyed afterwards? Well, Israel has already done in a way what it might have done afterwards. But by occupying extra areas, including the Jebel Hermon, what we call the Hermon mountain, Mount Hermon,
the Druze, yeah,
they're provoking Israel. They are provoking Syria. So the Syrians are, let's say, helpless. They cannot do anything against Israel.
At the same time, Israel is also befriending the Syrian Democratic Forces, engaging with them diplomatically in a way they never did before. So they do want to have some kind of hand in Syria, obviously, and some kind of leverage that would, in their minds, contain any potential hostile behavior on the part of al-Sharaa, particularly allied with Erdogan, who is, rhetorically at least very, very hostile to Israel. So it's a very complex situation, as you noted. Can we say that Iran and Russia are kind of over in Syria now? What about those two countries?
Iran may be over now in Syria, but Russia perhaps not, because if I can interpret the words of al-Sharaa well, he still wants to leave open that Russia has a kind of foothold, not a foothold in the whole of Syria, but having the harbor or the military base in Humaymim. So I think this is still open, but the presence of Iran now I think, is over. And also from the strategic point, that was the main reason for Israel also to attack, having attacks in Syria to prevent any possibility for arming Syria and Lebanon through Syria.
And Turkey obviously has this interesting relationship with Russia where, depending on the theater, they cooperate, and others, of course, they're rivals. And perhaps in Syria, Erdogan and Putin have reached some kind of accommodation where they kind of manage each other's interests. I guess my final question would be this, Ambassador Trump. How interested do we think Trump will be? And it's, of course, a great concern for the Kurds in particular, who view the presence of US forces there as their security umbrella, and which is very much linked now almost exclusively to the ISIS threat, because, as you said, Iran is no longer, doesn't present the same kind of concern that it did. So how do you think Trump will handle Syria? Will he care? Will he be interested? Or will he just leave it to the others to decide and handle?
I think, put it bluntly, he couldn't care less about the Syrians. And if he would choose between the Kurds in Syria and Turkey, he would always choose for Turkey, because that is much more important strategically. He would leave, I would call it a betrayal of the Kurds, because they are not interested in the Kurds as Kurds, but only in the Kurds as being a counterweight against the Islamic State. And then at the time against Assad, but more against Islamic State. So the American position is, I think, fully based on what they think their strategic interests are. And their strategic interests don't overlap with any interest for the people there at all.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here today. And we hope to have you on our show again sometime in the near future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of On the Middle East. For more in-depth coverage of the region, go to our website, www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.